So we're going to have a quick discussion that's going to be moderated by Kyra Antone, President of Natives and Media on campus, and just talk a little bit about the process, answer any questions. Kyra, right there in the middle. And so I'll just introduce everyone up here. I just introduced Kyra. I'm Ben Shores, here at the Murrow College. I'm really pleased to have Lailani Upham, our assistant producer and member of the Blackfeet Nation, as well as Torsten Kjellstrand, the co-producer, co-director, guy who bought all the food, pretty much everything. So, arm candy. Yeah, he's the arm candy.
Hi, so the first question I wanted to ask you guys is, how do you as the filmmaker tell the story and ensure that the individuals whose story you are telling has the most prominent voice?
A little bit of backstory to this whole project. It only took us 5 years to pull this together. We conducted several dozen interviews, oral histories that we archived. We created a mobile app with 6 short films that we created for PBS Indies. So that was the first step in the process. Those digital shorts are used in tribal schools on the Blackfeet Reservation. And then we had to take about 100 to 120 hours of footage, and we had to get it down to 25 minutes. And that's how we spent the next 4 years. Essentially, we really wanted to see what happened to Butch as he came back, and he made this decision to try to re-engage with his community, and we wanted to see how that story played out. And ultimately, we had to find a central character. And as we have talked about in other venues, I think any other filmmaker or editor could take that 100 hours of source material and go through and find a different narrative. And ultimately, we had to find the story that we thought best told this. And for us, I think it's embodied by that sentiment that the story of this tragedy is a story about family. It's about connections. And we thought that really resonated. But Lailani and Torsten.
It's all yours. Okay. I don't have that much to add, except that the shorts we made felt like they were appropriate to be short films. It was not until, for me, it was not until I heard Butch say, we met him right as he came back from being gone for 50 years, and he said, I came back to see if I could still get that feeling like I am a Blackfeet. And then it felt like present tense storytelling. It wasn't a story about a past event. Then all of a sudden we could hitch ourselves to a story, try to tell a story that was happening in front of us. And there was suspense for us whether he would be able to find that space or not. That's when I thought, oh, we've got something that could be a little longer film.
I think telling the accurate story was being there so long. Everybody got to know who we were, and as a team, and trust was built. And so I think, yeah, building on story after story, and people just pointing us in directions of who was a survivor, who knew of the stories of the flood, and then they just started rolling out. And I think that's how found out about Butch, right? And yeah, so just being there and listening for the most part. And like he said, there was so much footage of interviews that had to go through, and we did. We were exhausted. I remember that first run where they took me home, and I just walked right upstairs, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and I didn't wake up till the next day. It was, yeah. So just being in the field and talking to people, meeting people, and just listening and getting them down on video is really what I think was key to getting it accurate, because then they were trusting us as listeners and storytellers.
But we didn't know Lailani before we started this process. We had a friend in common, Rob McDonald. So I'm curious, Lailani, what you thought when these 2 white guys showed up and said, hey, we want to tell a Blackfeet story.
Did he really just ask that question?
I had a similar one, so.
Let's get to the point here, right?
I thought it was the audience supposed to be asking the questions, or her. Well, actually, I didn't really think of two white guys going in telling the story. I thought of two journalists telling the story, and I really felt right off the bat, I really felt a good feeling about you guys, that you were genuine and authentic, and you really wanted to tell the story right, and there was a general interest in our community and telling our story that was untold on the Blackfeet Res. So, yeah, so that's why I was on board right away to join in and say, yes, let's do this.
And how did it even come about that you guys decided to tell this story, and why is it important? Did that change over time?
Lailani, can you talk about, as someone who grew up on Blackfeet land, how you heard about these stories? They were sort of whispers that didn't become full conversations.
Yeah, basically there really wasn't any stories to be told. People didn't talk about it, just like they said in the film, that no one really talked about it. And I, growing up kind of right after that era, is no, I didn't hear anything. All I ever heard about was the flood homes. Like, there were certain kind of homes that looked like little monopoly homes and really flimsy and not very well made, and those homes were the flood homes. Well, what about the flood homes? And just maybe there was a flood in '64. That was it. There wasn't really anybody talking about it. So when we got into it, and I started hearing more stories and people and how devastating it was, I mean, I come from that community and I didn't even know. So that was just significant in telling of, in a sense, the resilience of our community and our people.
Did it spark conversation within your family, or did you have more questions regarding it?
It did. I think it sparked conversation. It's still sparking conversations. Like, people are still saying, well, so-and-so had this. And I'm even learning a lot. In fact, just this week, just somebody that's closely related to me on a different reservation, Fort Belknap, mentioned something on our site that so-and-so knew Eloise and her husband, and they used to go to the boarding school where I don't know if it was her, maybe she went to school there, and she remembers as a little girl that family, and then she remembers the flood, and I had no idea that my cousin from Fort Belknap knew anything about the flood and had stories there. So it continues to just, the story keeps going on and on. I mean, I just had somebody mention on a post as well that why didn't you talk to so-and-so, So it's so huge. And it's still so real, even though it's so long ago. And I think possibly part of it is because people didn't talk about it, and now it's coming out, and there's healing going on through the storytelling yeah.
I don't think we really knew what we were doing, like we knew the impact that it had on the community until we started doing some of these interviews that we mostly thought of as oral histories that would be stored in the tribal archives, and that's, I think, where they are now. But there was some just striking similarities in these conversations that people would say, I've never told anybody about this. We don't talk about this. No one knows about this. And these were all elders who we were talking to, and it felt a little bit like we showed up at a time when many of those elders understood that if the stories didn't get told soon, they were never going to be told. And I think in that sense, we were just kind of handy because we were there, we had cameras, we had audio equipment, but that led to more conversations. And as we started hearing more of these stories, we started to understand the complexity of this story, but also I had not realized the impact on the community, how transformative this was to the community. It went from a ranching community where most people lived on individual or family ranches out in, as an immigrant to this country, this is what America looks like. All that stuff in the East Coast and on the West Coast, like, that's not America, that's something else. America is the wide open country of Montana if you're a little kid in Sweden. And this place where people lived in that landscape, and all of a sudden now most people live in Browning in town, and that has not changed. So it felt like we just kind of showed up. You have a question?
How large was the community then, and how large is it now?
One of the things we found is that it's really hard to define community in a traditional sense of here's the census area and here's the population. We're talking about traditional clans and societies. And then we're talking about, when we talk about family, we're talking about extended family, all told on the reservation. Even within the reservation, one of the things we wanted to avoid in this story was this sort of idea of this monolithic native culture. Everyone who is native has the same experience. And when we were on the Blackfeet reservation, we saw tremendous differences when we went from the north end of the reservation to the south end. And that population that was really devastated by the collapse of the dam, it was just really a few hundred people living in those outlying areas, and they really considered themselves to be the true Blackfeet, and that's where part of Butch's pride came from.
Yes.
I was wondering how this flood compared to the flood in Rexburg that happened in the 80s.
I'm not very familiar with that. All across the Northwest and across the West in 1964 was a tremendous winter, and we had a situation where we had tremendous snowfall, and then we had a warm rain that just lasted for days and days and days that precipitated this disaster. But before that, within this community, there was all sorts of pre-existing trauma. There was the starvation winter about 7 years before the flood happened that decimated many families on the Blackfeet Reservation. And then there are smaller tragedies. Butch was taken from his family and sent to boarding school from this community that he loved, and would spend 9 months in South Dakota and then come back. So there's all sorts of different levels of sort of trauma and healing that he had to go through in this process.
So working with the people creating this film, how was that? You got to know a lot of these people personally, and you've worked with them for years. And creating this story, has it changed?
Well, that's why I'm a journalist, is because this is how I love to move through the world, is to meet people. And I'm not I play an extrovert in a film somewhere, but I'm not really an extrovert. But when I get a camera, it's my excuse to knock on people's doors and to ask who they are, and to see how they solve kind of the big problems of finding meaning in your life and all of that. So that part of it I loved. I go back to Minnesota every summer, and I always drive through the Blackfeet Reservation now and visit with folks that I met. So I think the flip side of that is you have to be very careful. If you're a college professor, if you come from kind of the dominant culture, there is a risk that when you walk into a community, especially one that is you're going to ask to talk about trauma, that you exploit that somehow. That rather than becoming a useful storyteller, you become someone who takes a story and uses it to your own means. And we tried to be very careful about that, but that assumes that we know enough and that we, oh, that's my watch, sorry. Time to go, no. And I think that's part of why we needed this to take a long time, because one of the sins journalists commit, often because of deadlines, is we go in, we take a story, we take the quickest story we can, or the one that fulfills our expectations, and then instead of actually the story being an exploration or explanation. It's just a reinforcement of stories that are already out there, many of which are incomplete or inaccurate. So I think I just didn't answer your question, but I said something, yeah.
I think we're incredibly inefficient, and we love that. I was talking to a friend the other night who's an engineer, and he's always talking about efficiency, and we love being inefficient. We're sort of in our, Torsten and I like to say we're in our post-journalism career, where we can kind of spend a lot of time on stories. Journalism has some very rigid ethical boundaries that I think we challenge. We did become friends with people, and we're okay with that as a part of the storytelling process. But I think this sort of the long tail of journalism and the long tail of trauma in these communities, it takes time and it takes inefficiencies. And sometimes you have to sit and have a cup of coffee and build those relationships. And I grew up just off the Blackfeet Reservation. My father was an attorney from the Midwest, and he moved us to north central Montana to represent tribal members. And I was always curious why he moved us there. And so for me, this film started about 5 years after my father's death. And I think it was a way for me to get this sense of why do we call a place home? Is it just pure happenstance that we land in a geographic place that becomes home? And so I didn't want to co-opt Butch's story, but I was also really curious. It resonated with me as what brings us to home in that sense.
Did you, I'm been curious if Lailani thought of your sense of being home on the Blackfeet Reservation in the making of this. Well, I was trying to go off of what Ben said, who grew up outside the reservation, who moved to the place. You grew up there. You've always been there, right? And have you reflected on that in any because of this film?
Yeah, I really connected with just, total different story, but connected to the feeling of being far away and gone from the Blackfeet Reservation, because as a young woman, I joined the military and left and got married and lived on the East Coast and down south, and it was a long time before I came back home. And so in that sense, yeah. And then with the stories and the interviews, going back to her question of has the relationships or whatever changed or whatever, I don't think I was really thinking about that from the beginning to now. I'm still just Lailani, I think, in the community. I'm just, I really met new people. But yeah, I don't think it really has changed because I'm there and that's my home and relatives, people, so yeah.
We saw changes even over the course of interviews that were really rewarding to us. And I think of one interview of where we brought together a young woman who had been rescued by her uncle from the floodwaters. And we didn't put this in the final cut of the film, but for 50 years, he'd never told her. And so they had this incredible moment where she realizes it on camera and just sort of breaks down because, you gave me life, as she says. And he died about about a year after we filmed that interview. And when we went back to the reservation and I saw her and she just came up and gave a big hug, that I knew we were okay. But we saw relationships change within members of the community. Another young man, or not young man, he was young when he tried to rescue a group of women and children who were trapped in a pickup, and he couldn't. And he came across one of the survivors after 50 years, and he had just never told her, and she'd walked past him on the street her entire life and never knew about his connection. So those were the relationships, I think, that we really prized and we like to see develop, those relationships within tribal members rather than maybe to us.
And you talked earlier about the advantages and disadvantages of being in the community and being outside of the community, and so that you, all while making this film, you have somebody that was within the community, and then you have two outside perspectives. Can you tell us about how it was creating the film through that?
So I'm an immigrant to this country. I came as a boy, and I still think this is the strangest place on the planet. And not the Blackfeet Reservation specifically, the United States in general. It's a really interesting place, full of stories. It's this mashup of cultures, and those stories range from funny and kind of quirky to some that are really very tragic, and some that we as a country are not facing very well. And so I think the dangers of being an outsider, I think I've talked about a little bit, and that is that you think you know something, but you don't. And stories are such powerful things that, especially those of us who have access to publication and kind of all the tools and all the power of storytelling, if we use that to perpetuate stereotypes or destructive imagery, we really can cause a lot of harm. But in that, there's also an opportunity to push against that. And it always gets you in trouble in some way. The advantage of being an outsider is that no one expects you to know anything. I think one of the reasons, on occasion, that people talk to us about the thing that they'd never talked to anybody else about is because we were not of the community. We came in and people knew they had to speak slowly and explain things thoroughly because we didn't know anything. We were not expected to know anything. So in a way, in some situations, we were allowed to ask questions that maybe someone of the community wouldn't be. And all of this is dangerous territory. And in this film, it showed up in music. I'm just talking to Lailani saved us in one of our short films. We had thrown in a piece of music that we thought sounded cool, and it was kind of a celebratory part of this little film. Well, it's a funeral song, and that's a bad thing. And that was not us sitting around saying, how are we going to do some kind of crazy thing here? It was just ignorance, pure ignorance, and it's hard to get yourself up to speed. So that's when I think you need some access to information and some access to knowledge that has grown up in that place rather than comes from the outside. It's a form of arrogance to come from the outside and think, oh, I know enough about storytelling that I'm going to tell this accurately.
Yeah, we really had to wrestle with that when we went through all these interviews and all this B-roll and start to sort of sort out who the characters are going to be. And we had a lot of arguments or debates maybe about that. What is the story of this community? And I think of it as like little data points. All these interviews are data points, and we're trying to draw this narrative line across those data points to figure out what is the story of the community. And I'm not saying we got it right, but we're accustomed to getting things wrong. But trying to figure out what are the connections here that unify those different stories.
I think it's also important to remember that there's not the community is not one thing. If we show this film, when we have showed this film on the Blackfeet Reservation, I don't think everyone in that community thinks the same things. And there's some kind of evidence of that some people like the music. Some people have said, we wish the music sounded more Blackfeet. But when we showed the film, there was, in an early iteration of this, there was a piece of the Blackfeet Indian days from the powwow, and there was some music from that. And then we got people from the community who said, God, can we please have a native film that doesn't have dancing with leather and feather and drum music? You know, so I think we had to understand too that there was not a monolith of opinions about this in the community. And why would there be? Because no other community, right? WSU, I would guess people feel differently about some very important issues. And that's true of any community. So.
The music was a real challenge for us because we didn't want to take a film that we had produced and then sort of add a layer of Blackfeet music and some powwow scenes and call it good. Like, we didn't want to come across as trying to put this sheen of authenticity over it. And so we really struggled with the music, and ultimately we said we don't want to create a sound to this film that sort of covers up that the fact that this is a film produced by us as outsiders.
And Lailani, how is your perspective, like coming from the community? How do you believe it was like a disadvantage or an advantage?
Music.
Just the document.
As far as me coming from the community and being part of the storytelling team, I think it was a great advantage. I felt like that folks who knew me and my family, and we all came in together as a team and asking questions, and they were more open. There was a lot more people open, and a lot more people giving us kind of tips to who to talk to and information like that. Yeah. As far as disadvantages, I don't know yet.
Can I say something about that? I think it was an act of courage by Lailani to team up with us, because if we had produced a film and she had helped us, and that film was harmful to the community, we fly off to our jobs at the university, and Lailani has to go back to that community. And that was a real act of courage. Now, we have gone back and we've shown these films and the shorts, and we've gone back to schools because we want to get it right. But I think what Lailani did was put her trust in us, and that comes with great risk in her community.
And you mentioned going back to these places where you showed the film. You showed them over in Montana. How was the reaction of people, and how was it being in your spot and creating this and hoping whatever it is that you're hoping?
I think it was really welcoming and appreciative. I noticed that in some of the places that we did show, and the questions, and even just being in the community and talking to people, or them talking to me and giving me feedback. So it's really positive, and it's very appreciative.